Now this brings me to the reason the white people conquered the world. If it wasn't by genetic superiority, or because they believed they were superior to everyone else, what was it? It was a combination of two basic things. One was an advantage in resources. The other is the fact that life reproduces itself. That second part is simpler, but it's a lot more profound than the first. This is another universal law that applies to everyone and to every other living thing. The white man's conquest of the world was the way an inescapable biological law that affects every species affected our species. Wherever there is food that living things can eat, and living things can get to it, living things will get to it, and they will eat it. And then they will have children, and then there will be more of them, and that will happen until all the food gets used up. Then either those living things will starve to death when they run out of food, or else they'll find something else to eat. This is why refrigerator dishes were invented, and this is why people have to weed their gardens. There is no moral law that will protect your food from mold spores if you leave it in the refrigerator uncovered. When you clear a garden plot and fertilize the soil, you create a really good place for your plants to grow. But you also create a really good place for any plants to grow. So any plants whose seeds land there are going to start growing there. Once again, there is no moral law that will protect your garden. When the white people conquered the world, what happened? Living things spread out as far as they could and used all the resources they could get to have more children. So in one sense, white people are just a bunch of glorified refrigerator mold. But in another sense, everyone's that way. So if it hadn't been the white people who conquered the world, it would have been someone else eventually. So finally, a biologist named Jared Diamond decided he was going to figure this out once and for all. His book about it is called Guns, Germs, and Steel. 11,000 years ago, people were spread out all over the world, except for some islands way out in the oceans they hadn't reached yet. Everyone had figured out how to live wherever they were, and use their universal body structure and universal brain structure to provide for their universal physical needs, and everyone thought their culture was the best. Everyone in the world got their food by hunting and gathering it wherever they could find it growing wild. Everyone had a Stone Age technological level, everyone had domesticated fire, and no one had domesticated animals. A lot of people were nomadic, so they moved over the course of the year to follow the growing seasons as plants bloomed and animals moved around. But some people lived in parts of the world where food grew year-round. The people who lived in those areas developed different cultures than the nomadic people. The nomadic people couldn't own any more than they could carry with them when they moved. And they had to carry everything themselves because they didn't have animals to carry it for them yet. The sedentary people were able to build permanent houses, and then they were able to build more stuff to keep in their permanent houses. So they were able to build more complicated stuff. They were able to build stuff that was too heavy for one person to carry. They were able to build stuff that was specialized for doing things they only needed to do a few times a year, like tools for harvesting certain plants. The stationary people could also build other buildings, like storehouses to keep the food they harvested. So they could save up some food over the course of the year to better balance their diets, or to carry them over if they had a bad season and couldn't get as much of a certain kind of food as they usually did. So 11,000 years ago, People already had different economic levels, which were creating different technological and cultural developments as people thought of all the different ways they could use the resources they had available. About 10,500 years ago, on the plains of Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the people hunted and gathered food and had children, and eventually they overhunted the local gazelle herds. Now they were in the situation of running out of food to feed everyone. So just like the mold in your refrigerator, they were going to die if they didn't find more food. But of course, these were people, so they were intelligent. So when they stopped getting enough food the old way, they started looking for new ways to get food. Soon enough, they discovered that new food plants grew out of their refuse dumps from previous years. Eventually, they figured out the trick of planting seeds, and so began the agricultural revolution. By the way, most of Mesopotamia is in what's now Iraq, which means a lot of archaeological sites that date back to this pivotal point in world history are now getting tanks driven over them and bombs dropped on them, and a lot of archaeological museums have been looted. And of course, the invasion of Iraq was ordered by a conservative and was supported by a lot of people who always complain whenever anyone claims to have discovered any proof that white Christian Americans aren't the best people ever. This makes me wonder if perhaps a fringe benefit to invading Iraq, for some people at least, was the opportunity to help bomb world history and ethnic studies right out of existence. Anyway, a common misperception about the agricultural revolution was that it happened overnight. No, more likely it happened over the course of decades or even centuries. The first farmers of the world had never seen farming before, so they had to figure it out one step at a time. Since their goal was to produce food, people experimented with different ways of producing food, and they kept using whatever new practices they found were more effective than their old practices. They already had the tools and the storage buildings they developed for gathering wild food. They had to spend some of their time hunting and gathering to get food now, and they had some time to spend planting their seeds and tending their crops. They couldn't make the transition to tending their crops year-round until they knew they would be able to save up enough food to eat that whole time from the previous year. Nobody would think of spending all their time trying to grow crops that would produce food in 6 months if they had nothing to eat in the meantime. Even nomadic people took some steps toward the development of agriculture. Some nomadic people figured out the idea of sticking seeds in the ground and coming back later to see if anything had grown. Some thought of clearing land of plants that didn't produce food for them, so plants that would produce food could grow better. Some thought of fire farming, where they'd set fire to a prairie every year so a lot of tender new plants would grow close to the ground where they would be easy to pick, and they'd attract a lot of animals for the people to hunt. That's what the Native Americans did on the Great Plains. When you leave out little details like this, it turns into another way to use Eurocentric history to make everyone else look inferior. Mesopotamia isn't in Europe, but Judaism and then Christianity began in Mesopotamia. If farming just depended on sticking seeds in the ground, and that let people build huge civilizations whose cultural descendants went on to conquer the world, why didn't anyone else think of that? A lot of people assume that proves there must have been some sort of superiority or divine intervention involved. No, it was just people thinking of new ideas step by step. Now the sedentary people could do some other things the nomadic people couldn't. Since they could save up food, not everyone had to work at food production year-round. Some people could eat the food other people produced. Nomadic people couldn't feed many non-food producing people because they couldn't store up food. So stationary people developed specialized labor. They could support full-time inventors, craftsmen, politicians, religious leaders, bureaucrats, and soldiers. A lot of people regret having a lot of those things now. But back then, all those people were doing things that people had been doing already. If some people were especially good at doing some of them, then they could do them full-time in exchange for the food other people produced. So political leaders and bureaucrats organized societies, religious leaders tended to people's spiritual needs, inventors invented new tools and buildings, craftsmen built new tools and buildings, and soldiers defended their territory and conquered new territory. Agriculture was also developed in China 9,500 years ago, simultaneously in Mesoamerica and the Andes about 5,500 years ago, and in the Mississippi Valley about 4,500 years ago. It might have been developed on the island of New Guinea and 3 places in northern Africa, but for various reasons the evidence in each of those places isn't sufficient to confirm them one way or the other.